June 15, 1944. The humid night sky over Kyushu was clear, stars scattered across the heavens above Japan's southernmost home island. For months, Japanese soldiers and civilians had watched the Pacific War creep closer. Guam, Saipan, and the Marianas were under threat, but few believed enemy bombers could ever reach the sacred homeland. That illusion shattered as the droning thunder of engines rolled across the sky. Searchlights stabbed upward, crisscrossing in frantic sweeps. The wail of air raid sirens tore through villages and cities. Japanese pilots scrambled from their bunks, pulling on flight suits as mechanics rushed to ready their aircraft. But when they climbed into the darkness, what they saw defied belief. Above them loomed vast, gleaming machines, far larger than anything they had fought before. The bombers flew higher, faster, and heavier than Japanese fighters could easily reach. Their silver wings caught the moonlight, glistening like phantom giants moving in formation. These were not the B-17s or B-24s Japanese intelligence had occasionally reported in China. These were something else entirely. The ground shook as bombs fell over Yada, Japan's key steel-producing city. Explosions ripped through industrial plants. Fire blossomed in the night, and smoke curled upward. For the first time in the war, the Japanese homeland was under direct attack from American bombers. Pilots who engaged them returned shaken. One recalled, "We climbed with all the power our engines could give, but still they were above us. When we reached them, their guns spat fire from every direction. It was like charging into a storm of steel." These were the Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, the most advanced bomber the world had ever seen. Each carried a heavier payload, could fly farther, and defended itself with remote-controlled gun turrets bristling from its fuselage. They were more than machines. They were symbols of American industrial might, built at staggering cost and in staggering numbers. The Japanese had always believed their homeland was shielded by the vast Pacific. The empire's perimeter stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. For years, propaganda reassured the public that no foreign bombers could reach Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya. Now, with the roar of the B-29s overhead, that comforting illusion crumbled. The shock was profound. Japanese soldiers muttered in disbelief. How could the enemy cross such distance? How could these monsters fly so high? Are there more coming? What they did not yet realize was that this raid was just the beginning. Soon, hundreds of B-29s would pour from newly captured island bases. Soon, entire Japanese cities would burn under their relentless firebombing. And, in the ultimate horror, a pair of B-29s would deliver weapons unlike anything the world had ever known. In that first night raid over Yada, Japanese pilots and anti-aircraft crews confronted a terrifying new reality. America's war machine had delivered a weapon designed not just to strike Japan, but to break it. The question that hung in the smoky air was haunting. How did America build such a bomber? And how did it transform Japan's war from distant battles to fire raining down on its very heartland? For centuries, Japan had considered its islands untouchable. The Pacific Ocean was not just a barrier of water. It was a shield, a natural moat stretching thousands of miles. When the empire launched its war in 1941, striking Pearl Harbor and sweeping across Southeast Asia, few in Tokyo imagined that American planes would ever darken the skies above their own cities. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Force prided themselves on being the guardians of this sacred homeland. Their strategy relied on building a defensive perimeter, an iron ring of islands stretching from the Philippines through the Marianas and deep into the Central Pacific. This ring was supposed to make Japan's home islands unreachable. Even if the Americans tried, their fleets would be chewed apart long before bombers could strike Tokyo or Osaka. Propaganda reinforced this belief. Newspapers and radio broadcasts assured the public that the enemy would never breach Japan's protective wall. Civilians lived with wartime hardships, but few truly feared that American bombs could fall on their neighborhoods. The war, they believed, would remain far away, confined to the jungles of Burma, the reefs of the Pacific, and the skies above China. But as 1942 turned into 1943, the tides shifted. The American island-hopping campaign began to carve into Japan's perimeter. One by one, the strongholds fell: Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. Each island seized brought U.S. bombers a little closer to Japan itself. Yet even then, a problem remained. The Pacific was vast. American heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 did not have the range to reach Japan from safe bases. The distance was too great, the ocean too wide. To strike directly at Japan's industrial heartland, something new was required. Franklin D. Roosevelt had already anticipated this. Even before Pearl Harbor, he had demanded the creation of a super bomber, an aircraft that could fly thousands of miles, carry massive bomb loads, and defend itself with unprecedented firepower. The answer was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel unlike anything the world had seen. But development was costly and difficult. The B-29 project consumed over $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project itself. Engineers struggled with complex pressurized cabins, powerful new Wright R-3350 engines, and remote-controlled turrets. Delays plagued production, and accidents claimed lives. Critics doubted it would ever succeed. Meanwhile, Japanese leaders comforted themselves with the belief that America could not project air power across such distances. Their empire's soldiers still controlled swathes of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Their pilots, though increasingly strained, remained fierce. The homeland, they insisted, was safe. That illusion began to unravel when the first B-29s flew combat missions in mid-1944. Launched from bases in India and China under the difficult Operation Matterhorn. These missions were limited and costly, but they proved a point. For the first time, American bombers could reach Japan itself. Japanese pilots and civilians who witnessed these early strikes were unsettled. Though the raids were small compared to what was coming, they were symbolic. The enemy had crossed the moat. The Pacific was no longer an impenetrable shield. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any Japan had ever faced. When the Marianas fell later in 1944, the United States would gain the perfect launch pads for its new bombers. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29s could reach every corner of Japan. The empire's leaders, its pilots, and its civilians were about to discover that the homeland was not beyond reach. The war was no longer far away. It was coming to their doorsteps, carried on silver wings, with fire in its belly. And so, the question becomes, what happened when Japanese pilots first encountered the B-29, and why did these massive bombers leave them stunned? The story of the B-29 began not in the skies over Japan, but in the design rooms and factories of America. Even before Pearl Harbor, U.S. planners knew that defeating Japan would require striking deep into its territory. Conventional bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were formidable, but their range was limited. To bring the war home to Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, America needed something bigger, faster, and tougher. In 1940, Boeing engineers were tasked with building a super bomber. What emerged was revolutionary: the B-29 Superfortress. It was the most advanced aircraft of the war, packed with innovations that placed it decades ahead of its time. Unlike earlier bombers, it had a pressurized cabin, allowing crews to fly higher and longer without oxygen masks. Its wingspan stretched 141 feet, carrying 4 massive Wright R-3350 radial engines. Each bomber could haul up to 20,000 pounds of bombs across distances of more than 3,000 miles. Defensively, the B-29 bristled with firepower. Remote-controlled turrets dotted its sleek fuselage, each equipped with twin .50 caliber machine guns, and in some positions, a 20mm cannon. The gunner sat behind a sighting station, not directly in the turret, controlling weapons with the help of advanced analog computers. To the Japanese pilots who would later dive on them, the B-29 looked like a flying fortress beyond anything they had faced before. But building this marvel came at a staggering price. The B-29 program cost the United States more than $3 billion, more than the entire Manhattan Project. Factories struggled to meet production schedules. Engines overheated, catching fire in flight. Pressurization systems failed. Hundreds of test flights ended in accidents. Yet despite setbacks, America's industrial machine pressed on, confident that once perfected, the B-29 would change the war. By mid-1944, the first operational groups were deployed to India and China for Operation Matterhorn. The plan was bold: fly from bases in India, refuel in forward bases in China, and then strike at Japan's southern cities. It was a logistical nightmare. Supplies had to be flown over the Himalayas, the treacherous hump, in dangerous transport missions. Each bombing raid consumed months of preparation. The first of these raids came on June 15, 1944. Nearly 100 B-29s lifted off from China, bound for Yada on Kyushu, home to one of Japan's largest steel plants. For the Japanese defenders, it was a night of revelation. Searchlights illuminated the skies, and sirens screamed across Kyushu. Anti-aircraft gunners fired into the night as the massive bombers approached. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled in their Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi A6 M0s, expecting to meet familiar targets. Instead, they found themselves climbing desperately toward enormous planes flying at altitudes around 30,000 feet, well above the comfortable limits of their engines. One Japanese pilot later admitted, "We strained every meter of altitude, but they were still above us. When we reached them, their guns found us first." Those who managed to close in were stunned by the B-29's defenses. Instead of the familiar blind spots they exploited against earlier bombers, they were met with remote-controlled gunfire from multiple directions. Attacks that normally would have torn through enemy formations now resulted in crippling losses for the interceptors. The bombs rained down on Yada, igniting fires and damaging the vital steel works. The material damage from this first raid was limited compared to what would come later, but its symbolic power was enormous. For the first time, Japanese industry on the home islands had been struck from the air. Civilians who watched from the ground were in disbelief. Propaganda had promised that Japan's sacred homeland was beyond the reach of American bombers. Yet here they were, silver giants crossing the sky with impunity. Panic spread in whispers. If they could reach Yada, could they not also reach Tokyo? Pilots who survived the encounter returned shaken. They reported machines larger than anything they had faced, flying higher than their interceptors could easily reach, and defended by weapons they could not outmatch. The reports were passed up the chain of command, where senior officers dismissed them as exaggerations, until further raids proved them true. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1944, more missions followed. The logistics of Operation Matterhorn limited their scale, but the message grew louder. America had built a weapon that could strike Japan directly. The shock among Japanese defenders deepened as they realized that each raid brought not the end of American capability, but merely the beginning. Diaries captured the disbelief. One Japanese gunner wrote after an August raid, "We thought they had only a handful of these machines. But they come again and again. Are there factories without end?" Another pilot confessed privately that his squadron had no answer. "We dive, but their fire cuts us down. If this continues, how can we protect the Emperor's land?" In truth, the Matterhorn raids were only a prelude. They revealed both the power and the limitations of the B-29. While the aircraft was extraordinary, its effectiveness was hampered by poor logistics from India and China. Supplies were too thin, distances too long. Losses mounted, and results were uneven. Yet behind the struggles, the greater plan was already unfolding. As American forces drove across the Pacific, the capture of the Mariana Islands offered the perfect springboard. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29 could fly directly to Japan without the impossible supply chains of China. Once those islands were secured, the true storm would begin. For Japanese pilots, the first encounters with the B-29 were unforgettable. They had thought the homeland safe, their skies secure. Instead, they found themselves straining their engines to reach bombers that flew too high, facing defensive fire that cut them down, and watching their cities burn under bombs dropped by machines built in numbers they could hardly imagine. The shock was real. The question now was not whether America could strike Japan, but how often and how devastatingly it would do so once closer bases were ready. The summer of 1944 marked a decisive turning point. While the first B-29 raids from India and China had shocked Japan, their limited scale left some in Tokyo hoping they were anomalies, rare strikes that could not be sustained. That illusion collapsed when the United States seized the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were not just victories on the battlefield. They were the keys to Japan's heartland. From these islands, Just 1,500 miles away, the B-29s could strike every major city and industrial center on the Japanese home islands. And unlike the strained logistics of Operation Matterhorn, these bases could be fully supplied by the vast U.S. Navy, ensuring that raids would no longer be occasional experiments but a steady, unrelenting campaign. The scale of construction in the Marianas was itself astonishing. On Tinian, engineers built what became the largest airfield complex in the world. Runways stretched over 2 miles long, carved from coral and concrete, wide enough to accommodate hundreds of B-29s at once. Entire cities of tents, barracks, workshops, and fuel dumps sprang up almost overnight. Where once jungle and volcanic rock dominated, now stood the beating heart of America's long-range air war. By November 1944, the first raids launched directly from these new bases. For Japanese civilians and soldiers alike, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. On November 24th, 111 B-29s flew over Tokyo, targeting the Musashino aircraft plant. Though damage was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. The enemy had arrived over the capital. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled desperately to meet the threat. They climbed in their Mitsubishi Zeros, Ki-44 Tojo interceptors, and other aircraft. But by late 1944, many of these planes were outdated, their engines straining in thin air as they tried to reach the altitudes where B-29s cruised. Even when they managed to close in, the bombers' defensive turrets shredded their formations. A Japanese ace later recalled the horror of his first attack against the new enemy. "We fired bursts into their sides, but it was as if the planes were made of iron. Their guns answered from every angle. My wingman's plane vanished in flame. I returned alone, shaken and ashamed." As raids increased, the scale became surreal. Instead of dozens of planes, Japanese defenders now faced hundreds. Civilians described looking up to see the sky filled with silver specks, contrails stretching across the heavens like white scars. The roar of engines shook the earth, a metallic thunder that seemed to have no end. For commanders, the realization was crushing. Japan's once proud air defense forces were dwindling. Fuel shortages crippled training, and experienced pilots were increasingly rare. American production lines replaced losses with ease. Japan could not. Every new squadron of B-29s represented not just firepower, but an industrial imbalance so vast that even the most loyal officers began to despair. The raids themselves evolved. At first, high-altitude precision attacks targeted factories, rail yards, and military facilities. But the results were mixed. Winds at high altitude scattered bombs, and Japanese industry was more dispersed than expected. Still, even these imperfect strikes demonstrated a terrifying truth. No city in Japan was beyond reach. Eyewitnesses in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka recalled the disbelief as bombs exploded across familiar neighborhoods. For many, it was the first time they had seen their homeland under siege. The shock spread far beyond the physical damage. It struck at the very heart of Japanese identity. The empire that had once dominated Asia was now powerless to shield its own citizens. As 1944 drew to a close, America intensified the campaign. Hundreds of B-29s roared over Japan on a regular basis. Industrial cities were hit again and again, their factories gutted, their infrastructure shredded. Every raid left behind smoking ruins, and every raid reminded Japanese soldiers and civilians alike that the homeland was no longer safe. Reports from Japanese pilots grew increasingly grim. One wrote, "We cannot stop them. We dive, we climb, we sacrifice, and still they come. Each day the sky grows darker." Another commander admitted to his men, "Our task is no longer victory, but honor. We fight not to stop them, but to show the emperor we tried." Meanwhile, American crews were supplied with luxuries that stunned their enemies. B-29 bases had abundant food, medical care, and spare parts. Crews rotated, rested, and returned to missions with fresh equipment. In stark contrast, Japanese pilots flew with fuel so scarce that some sorties were canceled mid-air, and maintenance crews cannibalized wrecked planes just to keep a few squadrons flying. The imbalance was everywhere. It was in the skies, where B-29 formations blotted out the sun. It was in the factories, where American workers built bombers faster than Japan could destroy them. It was in the homes of Japanese civilians, where the once unthinkable sound of air raid sirens now became routine. By early 1945, the Japanese High Command was forced to admit what its soldiers already knew. The homeland could not be defended. The B-29s were too many, too advanced, too relentless. And with General Curtis LeMay preparing to unleash a new, terrifying strategy, low-altitude firebombing, the nightmare was only beginning. For the Japanese pilots who stared upward in disbelief, the question was no longer how the enemy had reached their skies. It was how long their nation could endure under the storm of fire that seemed endless. By the start of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its final and most brutal stage. For the Japanese people, the steady stream of B-29 raids had already stripped away the illusion of safety. But what came next would be far worse than anything they had imagined. General Curtis LeMay, a hard-driving commander known for his ruthlessness and clarity of purpose, took charge of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. LeMay believed the high-altitude precision raids were not delivering the decisive blows needed to cripple the Japanese war machine. The jet stream winds scattered bombs, clouds shielded targets, and dispersed factories made pinpoint destruction difficult. His solution was simple, devastating, and utterly new. Abandon high-altitude precision and switch to low-altitude incendiary bombing, targeting Japan's cities themselves. The B-29, with its massive payload and long range, was the perfect tool for this strategy. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, LeMay unleashed his first great firebombing raid on Tokyo. Over 300 B-29s roared across the dark skies, stripped of their defensive guns to carry even more incendiary bombs. They flew at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, well below the heights that had once given them protection. Japanese defenders, already starved of fuel and modern planes, were powerless to mount an effective resistance. When the bombs fell, Tokyo ignited. The wooden houses and paper-thin walls of the city became tinderboxes. Napalm and magnesium burned hotter than anything the city's firefighters could withstand. Within minutes, firestorms raged across miles of urban sprawl. Winds whipped flames into walls of fire. Whole neighborhoods vanished. Civilians suffocated in shelters as oxygen was sucked out by the inferno. By dawn, nearly 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. Survivors stumbled through smoking ruins, dazed, their faces blackened, their clothes in tatters. Soldiers who returned from leave walked into a capital that no longer resembled the city they had sworn to defend. Japanese pilots who had scrambled during the raid described scenes of futility. Their planes could not climb fast enough to catch the bombers. Their ammunition supplies were thin. Many turned back before even reaching the formations. One pilot, in a diary later recovered, wrote, "We circled above our burning capital. The flames were brighter than the sun. Our city was gone. How could any man fight on after seeing this?" LeMay's tactics continued. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, one by one, the great cities of Japan were set alight. Between March and August 1945, nearly 70 cities were devastated by B-29 incendiary raids. Factories disappeared in the flames, rail networks melted into twisted steel, and food supplies vanished as urban centers collapsed. By summer, entire regions of Japan were reduced to ash. For the Japanese military, the consequences were catastrophic. Production plummeted. Supplies for frontline units dried up. Civilians, once told that sacrifice would protect the emperor's land, now huddled in ruins, broken and afraid. The shock of those first encounters with the B-29 had turned into despair. Prisoners of war later recalled conversations with Japanese guards, who asked in hushed voices how America could send so many planes, so often, with so much destruction. "Your country must be endless," one guard said bitterly. "We kill one bomber, and 10 return." Pilots, once celebrated as Japan's heroes, faced impossible odds. With every mission, their numbers dwindled. Many were ordered to kamikaze attacks in a desperate attempt to stop the bombers. Few succeeded. The B-29s came on, wave after wave, seemingly immune to exhaustion. Civilians, too, recorded their horror. One woman in Nagoya described how her family fled through alleys as fire closed in. The sky rained fire. The earth shook. We could hear the bombers above us, steady and endless. I thought, is this the end of Japan itself? By the middle of 1945, The B-29s had become more than machines. They were symbols of inevitability. To see their silver wings spread across the sky was to know that no city, no family, no soldier was beyond their reach. For Japanese commanders, the question was no longer how to stop them, it was how to endure until the very end. The psychological collapse was profound. In diaries, soldiers admitted openly what could not be said aloud: the war was lost. Some wrote bitterly of leaders who still promised victory, even as the homeland burned. Others turned inward, vowing to fight on for honor, though they knew their efforts could change nothing. The B-29 campaign left Japan on the brink of ruin. Industry was gutted, civilians were broken, and the military was exhausted. Yet, as terrible as the firebombing raids were, the most shocking and devastating use of the B-29 was still to come. Because in August 1945, two of these silver giants would carry not incendiaries, but a weapon beyond imagination, one that would end the war in a single stroke. By the summer of 1945, the skies over Japan belonged entirely to the Americans. The B-29s came day and night, burning cities, smashing factories, and leaving millions homeless. Yet even after the devastation of Tokyo and dozens of other cities, Japan's leaders clung to hope that they might negotiate peace on favorable terms, or that the spirit of their people could still outlast America's will. Then, on the morning of August 6, 1945, a single B-29 appeared over the city of Hiroshima. The aircraft was the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets. Unlike the massive formations that had darkened Japan's skies for months, this plane flew alone, almost unnoticed. Japanese radar operators reported it, but with only one bomber in the air, few paid attention. Civilians looked up, some pointing, others ignoring it. What could a single aircraft do compared to the hundreds they had already endured? At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. What fell was not an incendiary cluster or high-explosive payload. It was a single device, little boy, the first atomic bomb used in war. Seconds later, Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash. A fireball hotter than the sun consumed the city center. Shockwaves flattened buildings for miles. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Others staggered through the ruins, burned, blinded, crying out for water. Within hours, Hiroshima was no longer a city but a charred scar on the earth. For Japanese pilots and commanders, the reports that reached Tokyo were incomprehensible. At first, some believed it was an exaggeration, that a massive raid had been mistaken for a single plane. Others speculated that hidden fuel depots or weapon stores had exploded. The truth, that one bomber had destroyed an entire city with a single bomb, was beyond imagination. And yet, 3 days later, it happened again. On August 9th, another B-29 boxcar dropped Fat Man over Nagasaki. Another blinding flash, another mushroom cloud, another city reduced to rubble in seconds. The stunned disbelief of Japanese pilots, already battered by endless raids, turned into complete despair. They had spent years straining their engines to intercept the silver bombers, diving into formations bristling with guns, risking everything to save their homeland. Now they faced the horrifying truth: no interception could matter. No courage, no sacrifice, no kamikaze dive could prevent a single bomber from erasing an entire city. One Japanese officer, upon hearing of Hiroshima, reportedly whispered, "One plane, one bomb, one city. Then we are finished." In meetings of Japan's high command, silence often followed the reading of damage reports. The firebombings had killed hundreds of thousands, but the atomic bombs carried a different psychological weight. They revealed that America's power was not only in numbers, but in a technology so advanced it rendered resistance meaningless. For the pilots who had once sworn to defend the Emperor's land with their lives, the revelation was devastating. They had been stunned by the first B-29s in 1944, shocked by the firestorms in 1945, and now crushed by a weapon that no defense could touch. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broke with centuries of tradition and addressed his people directly. His voice, calm and resigned, admitted what many already knew: Japan could no longer fight. The war was over. And so, the B-29, the machine that had stunned Japanese pilots from the moment it appeared, became the weapon that delivered the final blow. not only by burning cities with fire, but by carrying the atomic bombs that ended the war in an instant. The sky that once symbolized Japan's invulnerability had become the path of its destruction. When the first B-29s appeared over Kyushu in June 1944, Japanese pilots and commanders dismissed them as curiosities. Powerful, yes, but limited. By the end of 1945, those same silver giants had become the very symbols of defeat. They had brought fire to Tokyo, destruction to Osaka, ruin to Nagoya, and, finally, nuclear annihilation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shock for Japan was not simply the bombs themselves, but what the B-29 represented: the full weight of American industry, technology, and resolve. The bomber was a flying fortress of the future, pressurized, far-ranging, defended by computers and guns, built in numbers the Japanese could scarcely imagine. Where Japan built hundreds of aircraft a month, America produced thousands. Where Japanese pilots flew on dwindling fuel supplies, B-29 crews rotated through well-fed, well-equipped bases. For the men in the cockpits of Japan's interceptors, it was like fighting against the tide itself. They dove, they fired, they sacrificed, but nothing stopped the endless streams of bombers. Each time one fell, two more seemed to take its place. By 1945, even the bravest among them admitted privately what they could never say aloud: the war was unwinnable. The psychological collapse was just as profound as the physical destruction. Civilians who once believed in the empire's invulnerability now huddled in shelters as firestorms consumed their neighborhoods. Soldiers who had sworn to defend the emperor's land realized they could not even protect their own families. The B-29s did not just drop bombs. They shattered the very belief that Japan could resist forever. And yet, this was not only a Japanese tragedy. The cost was immense for Americans as well. Crews risked their lives on missions that lasted up to 15 hours. Many never returned, their planes shot from the sky or lost to mechanical failure. Factories in America ran day and night, workers sacrificing comfort and safety to churn out the machines of war. Behind every raid lay thousands of hands that riveted, welded, and built the arsenal of democracy. Still, the outcome was clear. The B-29 proved that industrial power, harnessed with technological innovation, could reshape the battlefield in ways that bravery and tradition alone could not withstand. It was a lesson that echoed far beyond 1945. For Japan, the silver wings that once brought fire also carried a strange mercy. The unbearable destruction forced leaders to surrender before an invasion could claim millions more lives. For the world, however, the B-29 ushered in a new age of warfare. The atomic bombs it delivered were not merely larger weapons. They were harbingers of an era where a single plane could end a city, where technology could determine the fate of nations in an instant. As Japan rebuilt from the ashes, those who survived never forgot the sight of the B-29s overhead. Silver giants against the sky, steady and relentless, raining destruction that no courage could resist. And for historians, one truth remains haunting. For the Japanese pilots who first looked up in 1944, stunned at the bombers that should never have reached their homeland, the war was already lost, even before the mushroom clouds rose above Hiroshima and Nagasaki.